This is my review of the recent unbelievable debate between Bart Ehrman and Justin Bass on whether Jesus rose from the dead. I've linked it below. I was going to play clips of the debate in this video, but I'm too lazy to do that. So what I just want to do is throw some thoughts out there on how I found the debate, and again, invite you to watch it if you haven't already. Just a brief caveat. I listened to the audio of the debate. I did not watch it. So the body language of the participants may have affected my perception of the debate differently than just hearing it. I don't know because I haven't watched it, but just keep that in mind. Now, my brief words about Bart Ehrman. I like Bart Ehrman's stuff. I've read at least half a dozen of his books, watched several of his debates, always enjoy him. I haven't heard any debates from Justin Bass before, but I was asked to endorse his book, The Bedrock of Christianity, a couple years ago, I believe, when it came out. And I enjoyed that book. I thought it was very similar to Gary Habermas's stuff, clearly argued, a good introduction to apologetic arguments for the resurrection. Could be a good text in any apologetics class. But I didn't think that came through in this debate. I don't think Justin Bass was well served with this debate format. As I was listening to it, I was thinking, Justin Bass is clearly an educated fellow, well prepared in his subject matter, but I thought of that famous Mike Tyson quote, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth." It kind of felt like Justin Bass came to the debate with a lot of arguments, all kind of lined out in every possible way to respond to Bart Ehrman, and then Ehrman just got in there, and immediately Justin Bass was back on his heel, and he never sort of recovered. He was pretty much, it seemed to me, on the ropes for much of the debate, if we want to go with a fighting motif, a boxing motif. Now, I grade debates like this with respect both to arguments, the quality of the arguments as I see them, and also the persuasiveness of the debater. How effective are they at persuading the audience of their views? I didn't find Bass's arguments to be well presented for the most part. I thought his earlier arguments with respect to the post-resurrection appearances were promising, but they didn't really get a toehold because Bass was on the defensive for much of the debate. And when he went off and talked about other things like the expansion rate of Christianity and post-Christian visions that people have had of Jesus, I just didn't think that was very strong. And at the very end, when he just mentioned the 500, from 1 Corinthians 15, I thought, what are you going to get from this at this point? They just weren't strong arguments. In terms of his persuasion, I also didn't find that he was very, very effective. And this is going to lead me in a moment into just talking a little bit about some of their aptitudes during the debates. Ehrman, I thought some of his arguments were strong, some of them not so much. And I'll say more in particular about how I think of his philosophy of history, which I think he's just committed to a methodological naturalism, which it still seems to me is pretty woolly in terms of some of the ways that he articulates or thinks about it. And that would be a potential Achilles heel that Justin Bass could have honed in on if he had been, I think, more dialed into the arguments as they were unfolding. But overall, taking in mind both arguments and persuasiveness, personally, I would give Bart Ehrman a B+, and I would probably give Justin Bass a D. And that's regretful because I was certainly inclined to rate Bass more highly, but I just don't think he did that well in the debate. Overall, the tone was bad, interruptive, persnickety, snipey, and there was an air of condescension and on both sides, I would say. Now, probably it is the case, and I think most people from what I've seen definitely think that Bass is more poorly behaved than Ehrman, and that may be the case. I suspect that is the case. I do think he interrupted more, and he made some little snide comments, like he'd kind of, just as Bart Ehrman's starting to make a point, he'd say, "Well, I can't wait to see what you have to say about that," or something like that. He can't just let Ehrman talk, which is not a sign of strength, right? You make yourself look weak, and you sound weak and defensive when you're always kind of interrupting in that way. I do think again that Bart Ehrman did this at times. There was one point where Bart Ehrman made a comment about Christians. Nobody everybody who believes Jesus rose from the dead is a Christian. And this often rhetorically is played for sort of supporting the idea that so ideologically that's the only reason anybody would believe Jesus rose from the dead is not on historical evidence, but because they already have a prior commitment or something like that. Bass responded by citing the case of the Jewish scholar Pinchas Lapid, who famously wrote a book in which he defended the historicity of the resurrection, but also didn't become a Christian or believe Christianity was true. And I've often heard Christians, I've never read the book, but I've heard Christians cite this book by Pinchas Lapid. But Bart Ehrman responded, it sounded to me like essentially guffawing at that citation, and that's not helpful. So I don't think all of the hostility and condescension was on the side of Justin Bass, although probably most of it was, or more than was on his side than on Ehrman's side. And I do think that both scholars at points tended to overstate, tended to use hyperbole in establishing points, saying no one believes this, or this is not true in a categorical way. But I also think that Bass, it seemed to me, tended to do that more. Like when he made claims about nobody converts to another religion with this kind of supernatural experience that they convert to Christianity, something to that effect, that just seemed to me to be not a true point. Certainly not a point that he had established to the satisfaction of any slightly skeptical audience. Bass spent a lot of time talking about an argument for the growth of Christianity, which was not at all, I think, a persuasive argument as it was developed in this context. It may be a persuasive argument elsewhere. I can't remember if he argues this in The Bedrock of Christianity, that book, but it wasn't a good argument in this context, that is for sure. He talks at one point about how Jesus said that something to the effect of his gospel would spread to all the ends of the earth. And then Bass commented on how most people in Papua New Guinea are Christian. And that's like around the other side of the earth from Israel. And that's somehow evidence supporting the truth of Christianity, that Christianity had spread to Papua New Guinea. That was, I think, the moment where I really felt that Justin Bass had jumped the shark, as it were. And the debate was just going downhill at that point. Ehrman then comes back and starts pressing the point of, well, if this is true, why don't more people believe? And then Bass tries to say, well, it was just certain people groups have to believe, but not individuals. And then Bass also makes a comment about how he believes that one of the reasons people don't believe the gospel more widely, why more people don't, is because, or why they don't have visions of Jesus or something else, is because essentially of the sinful will, that they're not open to it. This gets us now so far away from history and into a debate about divine hiddenness, which I think was just completely unhelpful at this point. And I think that kind of idea of blaming people, saying, well, the reason you haven't had a vision or the reason you haven't been persuaded of Christianity must be because you have a sinful will that is opposed to it, that's just a terrible way to argue. And I think it's empirically false that there are many people that are open to the evidence, but just not persuaded by it. So I wish Bass had stuck closer to sober-minded historical arguments, trying to press the point, for example, what was it that Paul experienced that converted him? So Bass has also said he talked about how he's working on a new book. And at this point, I was like, look, you've not defended your old book very well. Let's not talk about a new book, because more arguments that are poorly defended is not going to make your case stronger. Stick with the original arguments and try to defend those. But instead, he talked about how he's writing this new book where he's talking about conversions to Christianity throughout history, how people from Muslim countries and other countries have all converted to Christianity, and how this is, provides evidence, maybe not historical evidence, but evidence for the truth of Christianity. Well, the first thing is, of course, Bart Ehrman is playing the role of the historian here. He's defending historian's view. He's not interested in non-historical arguments for the purposes of this debate. And these are now clearly not historical arguments. So I just like, what is the point of this? It may be that Justin Bass is going to write a great book, a book-length argument in which he looks at the history and establishes that there is a compelling line of evidence down through history for people having supernatural conversions to Christianity, but not to other religions. And this somehow supports the truth of Christianity. But you're not going to make that point in 5 minutes at the end of a debate with Bart Ehrman, where you've been on the ropes for most of the debate. So the fact that he chose to segue to his new book at this point just didn't seem to make any sense. And I kept thinking about all the people that I know and that I've read about and that I've studied who have made conversions to other religions, many because of mystical, out of the blue experiences of a divine reality other than the one that Christians believe is described in Christianity. For example, one of my favorite singers from the 70s, Cat Stevens, when he was swimming in the surf, I think in 1977 off the coast of Los Angeles, and he has a mystical experience of what he concluded was Allah, and he becomes Yusuf Islam, and he leaves behind his life of Cat Stevens. Or even closer to home, Michael Sudduth, the Christian evangelical, I think, Christian philosopher who, like 15 years ago maybe, had a mystical experience and converted to Hare Krishna. And he's a devotee of Krishna. What do you do with cases like that? Well, you have to address cases like that if you're going to select cases of sort of supernatural, miraculous conversions of Christianity. You can't leave out these ones, because then you're going to be guilty of a glaring confirmation bias. One thing you could do, and this actually is also related, they had a lot of conversations about the angel Moroni and the foundational experiences of Mormonism. I wish they drilled down on those issues. By the way, Justin Bass sometimes said Moroni, sometimes said Moroni, which got me thinking of macaroni. I think it's Moroni, but I'm not a Mormon, so I'll have to ask a Mormon about that. But I wish that they'd focused in on something like that more. But it seemed like this was a debate that was off, going in 1,000 different directions, and really not in a satisfactory way addressing any of them, certainly with respect to Bass making a positive case. So Ehrman was, I think, excellent from a rhetorical standpoint of presenting Bass as an apologist and presenting himself as the sober-minded historian. And I think Bass didn't do really anything substantive to really challenge that framing. But I did get glimpses in the debate that the reality, I think, is far more complex. So, about 40 minutes in, Ehrman takes the view that the laws of physics are equivalent to the laws of logic. So that just as God cannot make 2 + 2 = 5, he cannot break the laws of logic, so he cannot break the laws of physics, which would a body resurrecting from the dead would involve. And this seems to be Barth's methodological naturalism now coming clearly to the fore, but in, I think, a surprisingly dogmatic and strong way. When you compare the laws of physics to the laws of logic and say that it is as impossible for God to break the laws of physics as the laws of logic, I mean, I think you are taking as unqualified a skeptical position on miracles or divine intervention as one could possibly take. Now, Ehrman is then asked, I think, by Justin Brierley at this point in the debate, well, what would it take to convince you that a miracle had occurred or something? And then he says, well, we'd have to hear from the physicists that it is possible that there be interventions in the laws of nature that do not violate them, or otherwise that they could be violated or something like that. You have to hear from the physicists. This was, to me, kind of a little bit frustrating, I'll be honest. That is the issues that we're talking about now. When Bart Ehrman says, well, there can't be an intervention in the laws of physics and so on, that's not a position from science. That's the philosophy of science. That's a particular philosophy of the laws of nature that Bart Ehrman is assuming. And I'm pretty sure it's not a view of the laws of nature that Justin Bass would accept, nor is it one that I would accept. I don't accept that view, and I don't accept methodological naturalism either. So I wish that there'd been more of a conversation about different views of history and the nature of history and the philosophy of history. Unfortunately, we couldn't get there because Ehrman presented his views just as uncontroversially what historiography is and what the nature of historical inquiry is. And I don't think Bass at all pushed the point of saying this is a particular philosophy of the laws of nature and a theology tacitly underlying it as to what an omnipotent being can and cannot do, that underlies Ehrman's view of history. So it's not neutral. It's not a view of history versus a Christian apologist. These are two different views of history, but we could never understand and distinguish them as such because the point really wasn't effectively pressed, in my view, by Justin Bass. Another thing related to that is, I mean, Ehrman is very good at pointing out where Bass is acting as an apologist. But come on, Bart Ehrman is an apologist of his own. He's an agnostic. He's a methodological naturalist. This is the way he believes we should interpret history. He's on a debate arguing, attempting to persuade an audience for his particular view of how history should be done, of which claims we should consider to be viable, plausible truth claims and which not. That is an apologetic. He's doing apologetics as much as Justin Bass is. But I don't think Bass effectively at all made that point. And so I think most people probably watch this debate. They come away thinking what we had was one sober historian who just approached history with neutrality, assuming an uncontroversial and obvious understanding of historiography. And then you had an apologist, an ideologue who's flying by the seat of his pants to justify his views any way he can. I don't think that's true. I think the reality is much more nuanced than that. But I don't think that Justin Bass was effective at making that point. I want to conclude by going back to near the beginning of the debate, which for me was the most interesting and important part, and the one that was most closely tied to history. Ehrman was asked at one point, of the 4 or 5 arguments that Bass had presented, which ones he thought were strongest. And he made the point of saying, well, the only one that he really thought was a historical argument as such was the one pertaining to the experiences of the apostles and the disciples of Jesus seeming to see him raised from the dead. That's a historical data point. We have to explain it. What best explained the fact that the apostles and other followers of Jesus thought that they had seen him alive again? And I wish there'd been more attention given to that topic and to Bass challenging Ehrman's attempt to counter his views as they explored that together. That would have been much more interesting than going off to these other arguments about the growth of Christianity to Iri and Jaya and about a history of people miraculously converting to Christianity in Muslim nations and things like that. I mean, that's just like so far away from the historical questions that were supposed to be, I think, at the heart of the debate. Here's the really interesting thing. So Ehrman made the claim that apocalyptic Jews didn't believe the soul could exist apart from the body. And thus, when they saw Jesus, when they thought that they saw Jesus again, the way that they would have interpreted it would have been as a resurrection, because that would have just been their only way to think about what they were viewing. Bass denied that. He denied that apocalyptic Jews did not believe the soul could exist apart from the body. Certainly that's been my understanding back to when I read John Cooper's Body, Soul, and Life Everlasting 25 years ago. I thought he made a great case for holistic dualism scripturally in terms of what Jews believed, what Christians believed, and then philosophy and science and theology. And certainly we get views in terms of broader Jewish views that are strongly dualistic. So in 1 Samuel 28, one of my favorite stories in the Bible, I think, when Saul goes to the witch of Endor and wants her to call back Samuel. I mean, the name Witch of Endor sounds like it comes out of the Lord of the Rings. And Samuel actually comes out of the ground like a ghostly apparition. But the body is remaining in the ground, the spiritual essence, the specter, a ghost comes out of the body, comes out of the ground. And it seems that Saul can't see the person or the specter, but the witch can. And so, and it is Samuel. Like Samuel talks, he says, "Why have you called me back?" And Saul says, "Well, I need this information from you." That's clearly a dualist anthropology. Now, of course, that's ancient Israel, but in terms of apocalyptic Jews, I've not studied this issue in any depth, but I'm just looking at the New Testament. I find in places like Luke chapter 6, I think verse 48, 49, Jesus is walking on the water. The apostles see him. They see this individual walking on the water, and they're terrified because they think it is a phantasma in Greek, which you can translate as a ghost or a specter, which one way to interpret that is a disembodied human being interacting with the living. That's a ghost, which would be dualistic. Likewise, in Luke 24, when the apostles encounter Jesus in this room with the locked door, we get the locked door from the Gospel of John, and they're terrified initially because they think they're seeing a pneuma, here spirit, which again I think is often translated in translations like the NIV, for example, as a ghost. So it seems to be a dualist anthropology that is being assumed here. And if that's the case, then if they were dualists, then it would have been reasonable for them to interpret post-mortem visualizations of Jesus as ghostly apparitions, unless there was some additional factor at play that forced them to conclude that this was in fact a being that had come back to life embodied. And so that's my thought. But if Ehrman is correct, well, then that could change that. So it would be the question of what evidence is there that apocalyptic Jews could not have imagined or would not have expected, if they had that kind of vision, that they would have not just automatically assumed it was a ghostly apparition rather than a resurrected person. Yeah, so this didn't get explored, and yet this was, I think, really an important and interesting point. And another thing related to that, I'll just throw this and then I'll conclude, but the other thing is, if Ehrman is correct, and apocalyptic Jews could not have envisioned a ghost, they would have just automatically thought any apparition they saw after any post-mortem vision after death, they would have automatically interpreted as a resurrected person. Then why don't we have before Jesus any other examples of resurrected persons? Why is Jesus the first one, right? Because Ehrman himself pointed out that post-mortem visions are not uncommon. They were not uncommon in the ancient world. They're not uncommon today. And yet I don't know of any others where they're interpreting those visions as post-resurrection embodied post-mortem resurrections. Right? It's only in Jesus. And if that's the case, then why didn't it happen earlier if apocalyptic Jews could not have envisioned this? I don't know. I haven't studied those issues in depth. So it could be that Ehrman is correct on this. My disappointment is that we just didn't even get into that. And that's the interesting conversation, not the arguments for the most part that Bass did present. So those are my thoughts on the Ehrman and Justin Bass debate.